Hello everyone and welcome back to the Haunting Hour. I know many of you use these videos to relax or drift off to sleep, and I'm so grateful you've chosen to spend this time here. Before you settle in, it would mean a lot if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories reach. And if you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated. Now let's begin. Story 1. It was a cold, crisp autumn evening, and the wind howled against my apartment window. I had just finished dinner and was settling in for a quiet night with a good book when a loud knock echoed through my empty hallway. The sudden noise made my heart skip a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone. I slowly approached the front door, hesitating before looking through the peephole. No one was there. A wave of unease swept over me, but I forced myself to brush it off as a prank and returned to the living room. I picked up my book, trying to sink back into its pages, but I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. Half an hour later, there was another knock, this time quieter, more deliberate. My spine tingled, and I cautiously moved back to the door. Again, nothing but the dimly lit hallway beyond. I double-checked the locks before heading to the kitchen to grab a glass of water, needing something to steady my nerves. But as I turned the corner, I froze. There, in the reflection of the window above the kitchen sink, I saw it. A shadow standing behind me, just for an instant before it seemed to melt away into the darkness. My heart pounded against my ribs and I spun around, but no one was there. The air felt colder now, and my breath clouded in front of me. Something was wrong. My phone was on the counter and I grabbed it, quickly dialing 911. But before I could press the call button, a soft, rustling sound came from the hallway. Slowly, with trembling steps, I made my way to the hallway and flipped on the light. The small table at the end of the hall, the one that always held my keys, was empty. The keys were gone. Suddenly, a loud thud came from my bedroom. My pulse quickened, and I felt a wave of cold sweat. I took a shaky step back and then another, inching toward the door. I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. I turned to unlock the front door, but my hands were trembling so violently that it took several attempts to get the latch to turn. When I finally opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, I ran straight into a neighbor who was just coming out of her apartment. She looked at me with wide eyes, startled by my panicked expression. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. There's someone in my apartment," I managed to stammer. She immediately pulled out her phone and called the police while staying with me in the hallway. Minutes later, which felt like hours, the police arrived. They searched my apartment thoroughly, but they found nothing. No one was hiding in the closet, no one under the bed. And yet, as they walked through the rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, lurking just out of sight. One of the officers returned my keys, which they had found in the middle of the bedroom floor, far from where I always left them. "Probably just a break-in," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "They must have run off when they heard you coming." But as I thanked them and watched them leave, I knew deep down that it wasn't just a break-in. Whatever had been in my apartment wasn't gone. It was waiting, watching, hiding in the shadows, just out of reach. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind against the window sent my nerves into overdrive. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, straining my ears for the slightest hint of movement. Hours ticked by, and eventually I must have drifted off because I awoke to a strange noise. It was a soft scraping sound coming from the living room. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was just the building settling. But the noise grew louder, more distinct, like fingernails dragging across the wall. My heart pounded as I slowly sat up in bed listening. The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I reached for my phone, but it wasn't on the nightstand where I had left it. Panic welled up inside me. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, my bare feet making no sound on the cold floor. The hallway stretched before me, dark and foreboding, the living room beyond it shrouded in shadows. As I crept forward, the shadows seemed to shift, taking on shapes that shouldn't have been there. I could feel my pulse in my throat, each beat echoing in my ears. When I reached the living room, I hesitated before turning on the light. My eyes scanned the darkness, searching for anything out of place. The light flickered on, casting harsh illumination across the room. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavy, like the atmosphere before a storm. My phone was lying on the coffee table, screen facing down. I was certain I hadn't left it there. With trembling hands, I picked up the phone, and as I did, I noticed something chilling. On the wall opposite the window, faint but unmistakable, were scratch marks. Long, thin trails etched into the plaster. My breath caught in my throat and I took a step back, my eyes widening in horror. The marks were fresh. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. I stifled a scream, my entire body tensing as I strained to hear anything in the pitch black. There was a faint shuffle, a soft exhale that wasn't mine. I wasn't alone. I backed away slowly, my hands outstretched until they found the wall. I fumbled along it, searching for the light switch, my fingers brushing against something cold and smooth. It moved. I jerked my hand back, a gasp escaping my lips. The shadow shifted again and I could feel it. Something was there, right in front of me, inches away. The lights flickered back on and the room was empty. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I turned and bolted for the door, not caring about the noise I made. My hands fumbled with the lock, my entire body shaking as I finally wrenched the door open and stumbled out into the hallway. I ran, not stopping until I was outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. I looked up at the window of my apartment, half expecting to see a figure standing there watching me. But there was nothing, just darkness. My neighbor, the same one from before, found me sitting on the front steps, shivering and trying to catch my breath. "You again?" she said, her voice a mix of concern and disbelief. "What happened this time?" I don't know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Something's in there. I can't go back." She nodded, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. "Come on, you can stay at my place for the night. We'll figure this out in the morning." I followed her inside, grateful for the warmth and the company. But even as I sat on her couch, wrapped in a blanket, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. My apartment was just across the hall, and whatever had been inside it wasn't gone. It was waiting, patient and relentless, just beyond the walls. The rest of the night passed in a blur of half-sleep and fear. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow again, felt the cold presence hovering just out of reach. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I needed to leave, to find somewhere new, somewhere safe. The next day I packed my things, my neighbor helping me as I cast wary glances around every corner. I moved out that afternoon, leaving behind the apartment and the shadowy presence that haunted it. But even as I drove away, I knew that some part of it would always be with me, a darkness that lingered at the edge of my vision, a chill that settled in my bones whenever the night grew too quiet. Whatever had been in my apartment wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was still out there, somewhere, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to let it in. Story 2. The antique mirror arrived at Maria's doorstep without any note or sender's information. It was a large oval piece, surrounded by an intricately carved oak frame, darkened with age and almost velvety in its ancient finish. Maria didn't remember ordering it, nor did she know anyone who would send her such an item. Yet there it stood, leaning against the wall of her hallway, its silvered glass gleaming dully even under the poor light of the rainy afternoon. Maria lived alone in her grandmother's old house, having inherited it after her passing the previous year. The house had always been an unsettling place for her, creaky floors, drafty rooms, and a sense of melancholy that seemed to cling to every wall. She had grown accustomed to the echo of her own footsteps in the halls, to the shadows that seemed to stretch a little too far at night. But the mirror, its sudden, unexplained presence unnerved her in a way the old house never had. She decided to move it to the living room, placing it carefully against a vacant wall across from the sofa. It was too heavy to mount, and she wasn't entirely sure she wanted it to stay. For the moment, though, she left it there, thinking she could figure out what to do with it later. That night, Maria found herself glancing at the mirror more than she cared to admit. Something about it seemed to catch her eye whenever she walked past the living room, the way it captured the darkness of the house, almost like it was absorbing the shadows. On the third night, Maria began to notice something strange. As she passed by the living room, she glanced at the mirror and saw, just for a fleeting second, something standing behind her reflection. It was a shape, vague and unclear, little more than a smudge in the dark. She stopped and turned, her heart skipping a beat. Nothing was there. The room was empty. She peered back at the mirror, and her reflection stared back, alone. Maria shook her head, laughing at herself for letting her imagination run wild. She made herself a cup of tea and sat down in front of the television, deliberately turning her back on the mirror. But the feeling wouldn't leave her. She felt a prickling at the back of her neck, a nagging sense that something was standing behind her, just beyond the edges of her vision. She turned quickly, and the room was still, silent, dark, empty. Later that night, Maria awoke to the sound of a creak, the distinct groan of the floorboards in the hallway. She lay still, listening, her pulse quickening. Another creak, closer now, as if something heavy were moving slowly towards her room. Her eyes darted to the bedroom door, half open to the dark hallway beyond. She held her breath, waiting. Then silence. Minutes ticked by, and Maria began to wonder if she had imagined it. She forced herself out of bed, each step hesitant as she padded towards the door. The hallway was empty, nothing but shadows pooling around the edges of the walls. She moved towards the living room, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't quite explain. The mirror stood where she had left it, reflecting the empty room, the moonlight streaming through the window. She stepped closer, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. In the dim light, Maria noticed something in the mirror, a figure standing in the reflection of the hallway behind her. Her heart lurched as she spun around. There was nothing there. Slowly, she turned back to the mirror and the figure was gone. Her own reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and trembling. She backed away, her breath quickening, her pulse roaring in her ears. The mirror seemed to shift, the glass rippling as though it were water. Maria blinked, and the room behind her reflection seemed to change. The familiar living room twisted, darkened. The walls in the mirror seemed to fall away, revealing a black void, endless and yawning. From that darkness, something began to emerge. A hand, pale and skeletal, reaching out towards her reflection. Maria's mouth went dry, her body frozen in place as the hand reached closer, fingers brushing against the glass from the other side. She watched, horrified, as her own reflection began to change. Her face, once mirroring her terror, went slack, the eyes hollowing, the mouth stretching into a vacant, chilling smile. The reflection raised a hand, waving slowly, mockingly. A sound, soft and distant, echoed from the hallway. A creak, followed by a whisper. Maria turned, her eyes darting towards the darkness beyond the doorway. When she looked back, her reflection was gone. The mirror showed only the empty room behind her, the shadows deeper, darker, as though something had been taken away. The next day, Maria called a moving company. She couldn't stay in the house any longer. She needed to leave, to be somewhere bright, somewhere safe. The movers arrived in the late afternoon, two men who worked quickly to load her things. She watched them carry the mirror out to the truck, relieved to see it go. As they loaded it, one of the movers paused, frowning. He called Maria over, pointing at the glass. "Hey, did you know this was double-sided? There's a hollow behind it." Maria felt her stomach drop, her blood running cold. She stepped closer, looking at the back of the mirror. There, behind the glass, was a narrow, dark space, an empty hollow, just wide enough for someone to hide. The mover tapped the glass, shrugging. Weird, huh? Almost like there was something behind it all along. Maria swallowed, her eyes fixed on the hollow, a chill creeping up her spine. She turned away, unable to look any longer. The movers carried the mirror out, and as they did, Maria thought she heard a soft, muffled whisper coming from the glass, a voice distant and echoing, calling her name. She left the house that evening, never looking back, but no matter where she went, Maria could still feel the weight of that whisper, following her, calling to her from the shadows. Story 3. The town of Red Hollow was the sort of place that seemed to exist only to be forgotten. Nestled in a valley between dark, dense woods, it had its secrets, the kind spoken of in hushed tones by those who had lived there long enough to know better. Chief among those secrets was the lake at the edge of town. It was known simply as the Lake in the Fog, a place surrounded by mist almost every day of the year, obscured from curious eyes. Diana had heard the stories growing up. People said you could hear voices if you went to the lake at night. Others said you could see things moving in the fog that weren't quite human, shimmering and wavering just out of sight. When she was young, her grandmother told her never to go near it. "The lake takes what it wants, child," she'd said, her voice low, urgent. "It pulls you in with whispers and secrets, and once it has you, it won't let go." But Diana wasn't a child anymore. She had moved back to Red Hollow after losing her job in the city. She needed a reset, a quiet place to start over. She was no longer afraid of the old stories. After all, they were just tales, fabrications meant to keep children away from the dangers of the deep waters. Yet something about the fog still drew her, beckoning her with a strange familiarity. It was as if it remembered her, called to her, and she felt foolishly compelled to answer. One night, after a particularly lonely evening, Diana found herself walking towards the lake. The mist was thick, swirling like pale, icy smoke, but she could see a faint light glowing through it, an invitation she couldn't quite resist. She approached the shoreline, her shoes crunching on the gravel, her breath misting in front of her face. The air was eerily silent. There was no wind, no sound of crickets or rustling leaves. It was just her and the fog. Diana paused when she reached the edge of the lake. The water was impossibly still, the surface a perfect, glassy reflection of the mist. She could see her own face staring back at her, blurred at the edges. She leaned forward, squinting. Something was off. Her reflection wasn't quite right. Her lips were moving. Diana froze, her heart thudding painfully against her ribs. She wasn't speaking. She wasn't making a sound. Yet her reflection was mouthing words, silent and urgent. She knelt down, her eyes widening as she tried to understand. The reflection's lips moved faster, more frantic, and she felt a sudden, inexplicable rush of cold dread. She could almost make out the words, "Run!" The reflection's eyes widened, its mouth opening in a soundless scream, and before Diana could react, a hand shot up from the water, wrapping around her wrist with a grip like iron. She gasped, stumbling back, but the hand held fast, pulling her towards the lake. She looked down, her reflection gone, replaced by a dark, empty void beneath the water, a yawning abyss that seemed to stretch on forever. She screamed, struggling, but the fog swallowed the sound. The hand was cold, impossibly strong, and as she fought, she saw them, faces in the mist, watching her, eyes hollow and mournful. They were the lost, the ones the lake had taken. Their mouths moved in unison, whispering words she couldn't hear, their eyes wide with despair. With a final desperate pull, Diana wrenched her arm free, falling back onto the gravel, her heart pounding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The fog swirled around her, and the faces began to fade, the whispers dying away until there was nothing left but silence. Diana scrambled to her feet, her entire body trembling. She backed away from the lake, her eyes never leaving the water. The surface was calm once more, her reflection nowhere to be seen. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the stillness, the fog parting around her as she fled. She didn't stop until she was home, slamming the door behind her, her hands shaking as she locked it. She pressed her back against the wood, her eyes wide, her breath coming in short, terrified bursts. She could still feel the cold grip on her wrist, the weight of the eyes watching her. She never went near the lake again, but sometimes at night she could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, calling to her from the fog. And she knew, deep down, that the lake wasn't finished with her yet. Story 4. It started with a mirror. In the dim attic of his grandmother's house, Peter found the strange old thing. It was huge, nearly 6 feet tall, framed with intricately carved wood depicting thorny vines, snakes, and unblinking eyes. Its surface had dulled with time, slightly warped, and something about it felt wrong. Yet Peter couldn't resist. He wiped off the dust and positioned it in his new apartment's hallway. It fit perfectly, he thought, adding an antique charm to the otherwise modern decor. The first night it happened. Peter stumbled in from work, tired and a little drunk, the neon glow of the city outside his window glinting in the old mirror's glass. He paused, glancing at his own reflection. He looked as exhausted as he felt, his eyes hollow under the dim hallway light. But then, just for a split second, the Peter in the mirror didn't look away. Peter blinked, shook his head. He must have been seeing things, he told himself, brushing it off as a trick of light, a mix of alcohol and weariness. He laughed nervously, his own echo bouncing off the empty walls. The next few days were quiet, but something shifted. Peter began to notice small, subtle differences. The reflection of the hallway behind him appeared dimmer, like it existed in perpetual twilight. On the 4th day, he found the light switch had vanished from the mirror's image. When he touched the frame, the wood was cold, almost wet, though it felt dry beneath his fingers. That night he heard whispering. It was coming from the mirror. Peter stood frozen, staring at the glass. The whispers were faint, distant, as if echoing through a long tunnel. He leaned in, his breath fogging the surface. He could almost make out words, a chorus of murmurs that made his skin prickle. Suddenly his reflection smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that stretched too wide. Peter stumbled backward, knocking a chair over, his heart pounding in his chest. He blinked, and the reflection returned to normal, his terrified face staring back at him, the grin gone. The whispering ceased, leaving only the sound of his ragged breathing in the still apartment. Peter avoided the mirror after that, covering it with an old bedsheet. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but every time he walked by, he could feel something watching him, something lurking behind the glass. It wasn't just his reflection anymore. It was something else, something that knew him, that wanted him. A week later, Peter awoke in the dead of night, his room bathed in darkness. He felt a chill and turned to see the hallway light flickering beneath his bedroom door. He heard the whispers again, louder this time, an urgent hiss calling his name. He got out of bed, his feet cold on the hardwood floor. The door creaked as he opened it, and there it was, the mirror, uncovered, the sheet crumpled on the floor as if someone had torn it off. In the glass, the hallway looked wrong, darker and endless, stretching far beyond the confines of his apartment. And there, standing in the dim reflection, was Peter. But this Peter was smiling again, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his eyes too wide, too knowing. Peter's reflection lifted a hand, beckoning. "Come," it whispered, though Peter's lips did not move. A cold dread settled in his stomach, but his feet moved of their own accord, one step, then another, towards the mirror. He watched, helpless, as his reflection grew clearer, closer, until his fingers touched the glass. It was cold, colder than ice, and as he pressed his palm against it, the surface gave way like water. Peter gasped, trying to pull back, but it was too late. The mirror was pulling him in, the reflection, the other Peter, grabbing his wrists and dragging him into the dark, endless hallway beyond. He screamed, the sound muffled, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the other side. The next morning, the mirror stood silent in the hallway, its surface dull and empty. The reflection showed the apartment, neat and still, bathed in the soft morning light. And there, in the hallway, stood Peter, smiling that same too-wide smile, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. He turned, walking into the kitchen, his movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. He hummed a tune as he poured himself a cup of coffee, his eyes empty, dark. From within the mirror, muffled and distant, came the faint sound of desperate pounding, a voice crying out, begging to be let out. But the Peter in the kitchen just kept smiling, his eyes never blinking. Story 5. It was 1983, a cold November evening in the quiet town of Bell Hollow. The kind of night when the wind howled through the leafless trees, and every creak of an old house carried the weight of 1,000 stories. For Ellen, it was just another night of solitude. The only sound in her small, worn-down cottage was the ticking of the clock hanging above her fireplace, a soft reminder of the minutes creeping by. She settled down with a blanket in her favorite armchair, a book in hand, trying to make sense of the silence that filled her home. It had been a year since her husband had died, and in that time, silence had become both her companion and her greatest fear. Each evening, she would read until the words blurred on the page, letting her weary mind take her away from the emptiness. But tonight felt different, as if the silence was too deep, too expectant. The wind outside seemed to speak in hushed tones. Ellen tried to shrug it off, focusing on the story before her, but the feeling persisted. She glanced up at the clock. 11:30. She sighed, her eyes drifting toward the dark hallway leading to the bedroom. The house felt bigger than it was, like the shadows had grown and were swallowing it, inch by inch. She closed her book, rubbing her tired eyes. Her gaze drifted to the window, where she noticed something strange, a light in the distance coming from the woods. It flickered like a lantern, swaying gently. The woods were dense and dark, and no one in their right mind would venture there at this hour. Yet the light bobbed closer, weaving between the tree trunks. Ellen felt her breath catch. Perhaps it was a lost hiker, or a teenager fooling around. Still, she could not shake off the unease that had taken root in her chest. A sudden knock at the door made her flinch, her heart pounding against her ribs. She set the book down and hesitated. Who could possibly be visiting at this hour? The knock came again, louder, more insistent this time. Ellen stood up, feeling her pulse quicken. She crept towards the door, the floorboards groaning under her bare feet. Through the peephole, she could see no one, just darkness and the dim glow from her porch light, swaying in the breeze. Another knock, 3 sharp raps. Ellen took a deep breath and opened the door, but there was no one there. Only the cold wind greeted her, tugging at her nightgown. She leaned forward to peer into the night, her eyes squinting against the dark. "Hello?" she called, her voice swallowed by the wind. No response. She frowned, glancing towards the woods. The light was gone. She shivered, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt standing in the doorway. Shaking her head, she closed the door firmly, the latch clicking into place with a satisfying finality. She turned, intending to return to her book, but froze in her tracks. Someone was standing at the end of the hallway. Ellen blinked, her breath hitching in her throat. A shadow, tall, thin, unmoving, loomed at the far end, just beyond the reach of the dim light from the living room. She could see no face, only the vague outline of a person. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. She hadn't heard the door open. There was no way anyone could have entered. "Who's there?" Her voice trembled, barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood, watching her. The silence stretched, the air growing thick with dread. Ellen took a step back, her hand fumbling for something, anything to defend herself. The figure took a step forward, slow and deliberate. Ellen's stomach twisted, her instincts screaming at her to run, but her feet felt glued to the floor. The light above her head flickered, and for a brief second, the hallway was plunged into darkness. When the light returned, the figure was gone. Ellen's heart pounded, her entire body trembling. She backed into the living room, her eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. The house was silent, but now it felt wrong, like something else was breathing within its walls. She grabbed the telephone from the side table, her fingers shaking as she dialed her neighbor's number. The line crackled, and then she heard it, breathing. Heavy, labored breathing, echoing through the receiver. Ellen's blood ran cold. She hung up, dropping the phone to the floor as panic clawed at her chest. Suddenly she heard it again. 3 sharp knocks, this time from the hallway door that led to her bedroom. Her eyes darted to the darkened hallway. She could see the outline of the door, half open, a shadow moving behind it. The knocking continued, relentless, echoing through the quiet house. Ellen took a step back, her body trembling, her eyes wide with terror. The knocking stopped. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the dark emptiness beyond. And then she saw it. A pale face, gaunt and hollow, staring at her from the darkness. A smile spread across its lips, slow and unnatural, stretching far too wide. Ellen screamed, her voice echoing through the empty house, and the lights flickered once more. When they came back on, the face was gone, the hallway empty. The clock chimed midnight. Ellen stood frozen, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her eyes fixed on the darkened hallway. She knew, deep down, that she was not alone. Something had entered her home, something that was not of this world, and it was waiting, watching her from the shadows. The ticking of the clock was the only sound that remained, each second a reminder that the night was far from over. Story 6. In the summer of 1976, Alan had inherited an old hunting lodge deep in the wilderness of Maine. It stood on the edge of a quiet lake, bordered by endless woods that seemed to hum with their own life. Alan hadn't visited the place in years, not since his childhood when he would accompany his grandfather, and the place had fallen into disrepair. The paint peeled off the walls, the dock was little more than splintered planks, and the roof sagged like a weary old man. But Alan wasn't afraid of hard work, and the isolation seemed perfect, a break from the world he so desperately needed. The first night he noticed the silence. It wasn't the calm, serene kind of quiet. It was oppressive, heavy, as though the world outside was holding its breath. He lay on the rickety bed, staring up at the cobwebbed ceiling, hearing only the distant lapping of water against the shore. A strange unease crawled up his spine, and his ears strained for anything that would indicate life. Nothing. He couldn't even hear the chirping of crickets or the rustling of wind through leaves. Just silence, like a great mouth had swallowed the world. The second day, while repairing the dock, Alan noticed something strange. Footprints in the mud along the lakeshore. They were small, almost like a child's, but the toes were elongated, almost claw-like. They formed a winding path along the water, stopping abruptly at the end of the dock. He frowned, staring at them for a long moment before shaking his head. Must be some kind of animal, he thought. Maybe a raccoon, distorted by the wet earth. That night, the silence grew worse. It pressed in from the corners of the room, making it feel like the walls were shrinking. And then, just as Alan was drifting off, there came a sound. A whisper. Faint. So faint he almost convinced himself it was part of a dream. "Alan," it said, and his eyes snapped open. His heart hammered in his chest. He lay still, listening, waiting. Nothing. Just the suffocating silence. He convinced himself it was his imagination, an echo of his subconscious in this lonely place. He forced himself to sleep, but his dreams were filled with the lodge, the lake, and something watching from the woods. On the third day, Alan explored deeper into the forest. He felt watched, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, like unseen eyes were following his every step. Occasionally, he'd hear the snap of a twig behind him, but whenever he turned, there was nothing. Just trees, standing like skeletal sentinels, their branches curling overhead to blot out the sun. It was almost dusk when he returned to the lodge. On the porch, waiting for him, was something he couldn't quite process. A doll, an old, tattered doll, with missing button eyes and hair made of yellowed yarn. He picked it up, examining it, a chill creeping through his veins. He knew this doll. It had belonged to his sister Emily when they were children. Emily had drowned in this lake decades ago. His grandfather had told him she had slipped from the dock when no one was looking. Alan dropped the doll, stumbling back as though it had burned him. He hadn't seen that doll since Emily died. How had it come to be here now? That night he heard the whispers again. "Alan," they said, clearer now, more insistent. He lay frozen, staring into the dark. His grandfather's old rifle rested in the corner of the room, and Alan's eyes darted towards it. The whisper came again, closer now, from just outside his door. "Alan, come play." It was her voice, Emily's voice. He could barely breathe. His throat was dry, and his skin prickled with sweat. Slowly, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet pressing against the cold wooden floor. He crept towards the door, heart pounding, every creak of the old boards echoing in the oppressive silence. His hand trembled as he reached for the knob. Suddenly, the whisper was right next to his ear. "Alan." He swung the door open, the hallway beyond yawning like a black mouth. The doll sat in the middle of the hallway, its head twisted at an unnatural angle, the empty socket seeming to stare right at him. Alan backed away, but the doll seemed to shift, dragging itself forward, the faint scraping sound barely audible over his panicked breathing. He turned, running back into his room, slamming the door shut. He grabbed the rifle, his hands shaking as he aimed it at the door. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony now, voices overlapping, echoing. They came from everywhere, the walls, the ceiling, the floor. His sister's laughter mixed with guttural, twisted sounds that made his skin crawl. The door rattled, the knob twisting as though something was trying to force its way inside. Suddenly, everything stopped. The whispers, the rattling, the oppressive heaviness of the air, all of it, gone. The silence returned, even more suffocating than before. Alan's eyes were wide, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He waited, the rifle still trained on the door. Slowly, he lowered the weapon, his heart still hammering. He took a step forward, then another, his hand reaching for the knob once more. When he opened the door, the doll was gone. The hallway was empty, the house still. Alan's eyes darted around, scanning every shadow, every corner, but there was nothing. And then, from the far end of the hallway, he saw her, Emily, standing there, her small frame barely visible in the dim light. Her head hung at an odd angle, her hair damp, water dripping from her clothes, pooling at her feet. Her eyes, empty sockets like the doll, locked onto his. "Come play, Alan," she whispered, her voice a hollow echo. Her lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't the smile he remembered. It was twisted, malicious. He turned and ran, crashing through the house, out the front door, into the cold night air. He didn't stop until he reached the car, throwing himself inside, his hands fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life and he sped away, the headlights casting long shadows through the trees. In the rearview mirror, just for a moment, he saw her. Standing on the porch, the doll cradled in her arms, her head still tilted at that impossible angle, watching him leave. Alan never returned to the lodge. Years later, it burned down, the cause of the fire never determined. But sometimes, late at night, Alan would still hear her voice, faint, drifting through the silence. "Come play, Alan." Story 7. The fog rolled in thick and fast, swallowing the lonely village of Ash Hollow whole. Beneath the ghostly shroud, narrow streets twisted like a labyrinth, while the damp air clung to the crumbling bricks of houses that had stood for centuries. Elizabeth Myers pulled her coat tighter around her as she stood before the old Victorian manor at the end of Vale Street. Her mother had passed away 2 months ago, leaving the house to her, and Elizabeth had finally found the courage to return to settle affairs. The manor loomed, its windows dark and empty like sunken eyes in a skull. Elizabeth hesitated, but she forced herself forward, her boots echoing softly against the cobblestone path. She'd grown up here, but it wasn't her home anymore. Too many memories lurked within these walls, some warm, most cold. She twisted the rusted key in the lock and stepped inside. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of neglect. The silence was profound, pressing against her ears like cotton. Elizabeth moved cautiously through the rooms, each one seemingly untouched, as though her mother might reappear at any moment and scold her for tracking in dirt. But Elizabeth knew better. Her mother was gone, her stern voice silenced for good. Elizabeth sighed as she opened the door to her childhood bedroom. It looked unchanged. The floral wallpaper, the old rocking chair by the window, and the small bed that had always felt too big for her growing up. It was comforting and unsettling all at once. But something was different. Something felt off. The rocking chair had shifted, its angle just slightly ajar, facing away from the window. She frowned, brushing it off as her imagination. After all, the house had been empty for months. She unpacked her bag in the guest room and started to make herself comfortable. As she set up her laptop, she heard it, a faint creak, almost imperceptible. Elizabeth paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, listening. The creak repeated, this time louder, more deliberate. It was the rocking chair, moving in slow, rhythmic arcs. Elizabeth swallowed, her heart pounding, and approached the room cautiously. The chair rocked forward and backward on its own accord, its movement so smooth that it was almost hypnotic. She held her breath, the air freezing her lungs as she stared. It came to a sudden stop the moment her fingers touched the door frame, as if it knew she was there. Elizabeth tried to rationalize it. The house was old, drafty. Perhaps a breeze had moved it. She tried to calm herself, convincing herself there was nothing to fear. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the manor into shadows, her sense of unease only grew. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that weighed heavy on the mind, letting it invent sounds that weren't there. In the dead of night, Elizabeth awoke to a noise that was unmistakable. A whisper, faint yet distinct. Her eyes snapped open, her ears straining. The whisper seemed to emanate from the hallway outside her door. It was her mother's voice calling her name in a cold, rasping tone. Elizabeth. She clamped her hand over her mouth to muffle her breathing, her body paralyzed with fear. Slowly, she pushed the blanket off and crept to the door, the floorboards cold beneath her bare feet. She opened the door just a crack, peering out into the hallway, her heart hammering in her chest. Nothing. The hallway stretched on, empty and dark, shadows pooling in corners. Then she saw it. At the end of the hallway, the rocking chair stood, and in it, a figure, shrouded in darkness. Her mother, her head bent at an unnatural angle, her lips twisted into a grotesque smile. "Come sit with me, Elizabeth," the figure rasped. Elizabeth's blood ran cold. She stumbled backward, her eyes wide, her breathing erratic. She slammed the door shut, throwing herself against it. The whispers grew louder, her mother's voice insistent, repeating her name over and over. The door rattled as if someone was trying to force it open. Elizabeth's mind raced. This couldn't be real. Her mother was dead. She had been at the funeral, had seen the coffin lowered into the ground. She pressed her hands against her ears, but the whispers seeped through, her name spoken with increasing urgency. Suddenly, everything stopped. The rattling, the whispers, the pounding in her chest. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Elizabeth slowly opened her eyes, her hands trembling. She reached for the doorknob and turned it, inching the door open. The hallway was empty. The rocking chair was gone. She blinked, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. Slowly, she stepped out into the hallway, her eyes scanning every shadow. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if it were waiting, watching. Elizabeth turned towards the stairs, intending to leave the house, but froze. At the foot of the stairs stood her mother, her face obscured by shadow, her body still. The only movement was the gentle sway of her head, as if it were barely attached. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. "You can never leave, Elizabeth," her mother whispered, her voice echoing through the silence. Elizabeth backed away, her heart pounding, her body trembling. She turned and ran back to her room, slamming the door behind her. She grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling to call for help. But as she glanced at the screen, she froze. The reflection on the black screen showed her, not as she was, but as her mother. The same twisted smile, the same vacant eyes. The whispers began again, this time from inside her head. "You can never leave, Elizabeth, because you are me now." Story 8. In 1923, the town of Weeping Hollow was more of a whisper than a place. People spoke of it like a rumor, its name spreading with the rustle of the wind across the fields of wilted corn. Those who lived there kept to themselves, and those who left never spoke of what they had seen. Evelyn was one of the few to move in rather than away. She was a young teacher, fresh out of school, and eager to bring her ideas to the small, seemingly sleepy village. She rented a room in a house owned by Mrs. Alcott, an elderly widow with a reputation for eccentricity. Mrs. Alcott had once been the town seamstress, but now she mostly stayed at home, tending to her overgrown garden and her collection of dusty porcelain dolls. The house was old, the kind of place with uneven floors and wallpaper that peeled away in damp corners. It smelled of mothballs and mildew, and the air carried a weight that made Evelyn feel she was never quite alone. Mrs. Alcott's room was upstairs, and Evelyn's was at the end of the narrow hallway on the first floor. Between them, a series of closed doors, behind which Mrs. Alcott claimed she stored memories too old for the world. It was the third night that Evelyn noticed something strange. She was sitting by her window, preparing lessons, when she heard a muffled cry. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but distinct enough that it made her put down her pencil. She paused, waiting, listening. The sound came again, more clearly now, a child crying. Evelyn rose from her chair and opened her door, stepping into the hallway. The light was dim and the wood beneath her bare feet was cool and creaky. She hesitated outside one of the closed doors. The crying came from within. "Mrs. Alcott?" Evelyn called, her voice barely above a whisper. No response. She placed her ear against the door, her heart thumping. The crying was unmistakable, a child's sob, rising and falling like waves against a shore. She tried the knob. It was locked. The next morning, Evelyn asked Mrs. Alcott about the room. The old woman, her eyes cloudy with age, smiled a thin, tired smile. "Just memories, dear. You'd be best not to trouble yourself with them," she said before returning to her garden. Evelyn felt a chill at the words, but pushed it aside. Perhaps Mrs. Alcott kept a radio, or perhaps she imagined the cries altogether. She had been tired after all. But the following night, the crying returned. This time it was louder, filled with more urgency. It came from the same locked door, and the sobs were punctuated with words, faint and desperate. "Help me, please." Evelyn's skin prickled with fear. She knocked on Mrs. Alcott's door, but there was no answer. She twisted the knob, but it was locked from the inside. Evelyn rushed back to her room and grabbed a hairpin from her dresser, her hands trembling as she worked it into the lock of the crying door. It clicked, and the door slowly swung open. The room was dark, the air thick with the scent of old wood and forgotten things. Evelyn stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. In the corner sat a doll, porcelain and perfect, dressed in a tattered lace gown. Its eyes, wide and glassy, seemed to follow her as she moved. The crying had stopped. She took a step forward, her heart pounding against her ribs. There, on the wall, was a small mirror, and in its reflection she saw movement. A figure behind her, small and frail. She spun around, but the room was empty, save for the doll. Then she heard it again, the soft voice, but now it was whispering directly in her ear. "Please let me out." Evelyn turned back to the mirror and her blood ran cold. The reflection was not her own. Instead, it was the face of a young girl, her eyes hollow with sorrow. Her lips moved, but the words were silent now, her small hand pressed against the inside of the glass as if trying to break free. Evelyn stumbled back, her body trembling, and the door slammed shut behind her. She screamed, pounding her fists against the wood, but the sound seemed to be swallowed by the room itself. The doll, now at her feet, had fallen forward, its face cracked, a single tear-shaped fracture running from its eye. The whisper came again, a chorus now, voices layered upon each other, echoing in the dark. "Let us out." Mrs. Alcott found Evelyn the next morning, collapsed in the hallway, her eyes wide with terror. She carried the young woman to her room, placing her gently on the bed. The old woman sighed, her gaze drifting to the closed door. A sadness etched into her wrinkled face. "You shouldn't have listened," she whispered, her voice almost lost beneath the creaking of the house. She turned and slowly made her way down the hall, her shadow long and thin against the walls. Behind the door, the crying began again, soft and endless, the echoes of those who could never leave, bound to the house, bound to the dolls that sat quietly in the dark, each of them waiting, forever waiting, for someone to set them free. Story 9. It was just after midnight when Eleanor first heard it, a gentle, rhythmic tapping echoing through the hollow walls of her new home. She paused in her unpacking, straining her ears. The old Victorian house groaned and creaked like an old ship adrift at sea, but this sound was different, intentional. Tap, tap, tap. Eleanor shook her head, dismissing it as a quirk of an aging house. She was alone here, having moved to the small seaside village to escape the suffocating crowds of London. She had spent most of her savings on this fixer-upper, a grand home with high ceilings and ornate moldings that had seen better days. It was supposed to be her sanctuary, a place to start over. The next evening, she heard it again. Tap, 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 followed by a faint, barely perceptible whisper. Eleanor's skin prickled. She wandered through the dimly lit rooms, her bare feet cold against the wooden floorboards. The sound seemed to follow her, retreating whenever she approached and growing louder as she moved away. "Old pipes," she muttered to herself, though her voice carried no conviction. She wrapped herself in her thick cardigan, her breath visible in the cool night air. Days passed and the tapping persisted, always at night, always when she was alone. It grew louder, more insistent, until one evening, Eleanor found herself standing in front of the old fireplace in the living room, her heart pounding. She could feel it now, the source of the sound. Something behind the walls was trying to get her attention. She picked up a hammer from her toolbox and hesitated. Her logical mind told her this was ridiculous, that there had to be an explanation. But something deeper, something primal urged her on. She swung the hammer, chipping away at the plaster. The tapping grew frantic, like a plea. Behind the wall, she uncovered a narrow space, a hidden cavity running between the floors. Dust billowed into the air, and Eleanor squinted through the gloom. In the dim light of her flashlight, she saw something that made her stomach lurch. A small wooden box, old and worn, wedged between the beams. Her hands trembled as she pulled it free. The box was heavier than it looked, its surface covered in strange symbols that had been carved deep into the wood. She pried it open, her fingers clumsy with fear. Inside, she found a bundle of yellowed papers and a rusted locket. The papers were covered in frantic scrawls, the ink smeared as though written in haste. One phrase repeated over and over: "Do not listen to them." Suddenly, the whispering returned, louder now, filling her ears with a chorus of voices. They were no longer faint. They were urgent, angry. Eleanor stumbled back, dropping the box. The locket rolled across the floor, coming to a stop at her feet. She bent to pick it up, her vision swimming as the whispers grew deafening. She could make out words now. Leave. Go. She is ours. The voices overlapped, a cacophony of rage and desperation. Eleanor's head pounded and she clamped her hands over her ears, but the voices were inside her mind, scratching at her sanity. In a panic, she turned and ran, her footsteps echoing through the empty house. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with malice. She reached the front door, her fingers fumbling with the lock. The whispers had turned into screams, an unholy wail that shook her to her core. Just as she flung the door open, she felt it, a cold hand on her shoulder. She screamed, stumbling out into the night, falling to her knees on the gravel path. The house loomed behind her, its dark windows like hollow eyes watching. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of her ragged breathing and the crash of distant waves. Eleanor looked back at the house, her heart hammering. In one of the upstairs windows, she saw a figure, a silhouette, unmoving, staring down at her. It was a woman, her face obscured, her hand pressed against the glass. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. Eleanor never returned to that house. She left everything behind. The furniture, the clothes, the memories she had hoped to make. The villagers spoke of the strange woman who had bought the old place and fled in the dead of night. They whispered about the house's past, the rumors of the widow who had gone mad, and the children who had vanished without a trace. But Eleanor knew the truth. The house was alive, and it wanted her, or rather, it wanted what she had found. As she lay in her small rented room miles away, she could still hear it sometimes, in the dead of night. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of something that refused to be forgotten, echoing through the walls of her mind. Story 10. Midnight whispers. In the winter of 1923, in a small village nestled deep in the Carpathian Mountains, there was a house that everyone avoided. The locals whispered its name with caution, barely letting it pass their lips, the Vasile Manor. Its windows were dark eyes watching the valley, and its pointed roof sliced into the sky like a blade. No one had lived there for decades, ever since the disappearance of its last owners, the Vasile family. They vanished without a trace one December night, leaving behind nothing but a dreadful silence and an empty house that seemed to breathe on its own. Christina, a young school teacher, arrived in the village on assignment. She had been warned about the manor, warned about the whispers that seemed to follow the very air near it. But Christina was modern, logical, and above all, practical. To her, these were stories, legends meant to keep children from wandering off into the woods. She rented a small cottage near the edge of the village, and for the first few days, life was quiet and uneventful. That was until she first heard the whispers. It started at midnight, a faint murmur just beyond her window. The first night, she thought it was the wind, a low sigh drifting across the mountain slopes. But the next night, it grew clearer. The sounds of voices speaking in hushed, hurried tones. Christina strained her ears, trying to catch a word, a phrase, anything. She opened her window and peered into the night. But there was nothing except the inky darkness and the chill bite of the winter wind. The whispers returned every night. They seemed to grow louder, closer. She could almost make out her name, a faint syllable carried on the air. Christina tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was an echo from the village, the sounds carrying strangely through the mountain valley. She mentioned it to her neighbor, an elderly woman named Eliza, whose face darkened as soon as Christina spoke. "Do not listen," Eliza said, her voice cracking with fear. "They call to those who hear. Once you listen, they never stop." Christina forced a laugh, but her stomach tightened at Eliza's words. That night, she locked all the windows, drew the curtains, and sat with her back to the wall, listening as the whispers returned. This time, they were unmistakable. Her name, spoken clearly and repeatedly as though someone or something stood right outside her door. The voices were joined by another sound, a rhythmic tapping, like nails against glass. Heart pounding, Christina crept to the window, her fingers trembling as she pulled back the curtain just a crack. Outside, in the pale moonlight, she saw them. Figures barely more than silhouettes, standing in the snow. They were facing her cottage, unmoving, their heads tilted slightly as though listening. Their eyes, black and empty, stared straight at her. She gasped, stumbling backward, and the figures began to move. Slowly, they stepped closer, the whispers growing louder, pressing against her mind. She backed away, her foot catching the edge of a rug, and she fell to the floor with a thud. The whispers filled her ears now, her name repeated over and over until it became a roar. Desperate, Christina scrambled to her feet and bolted to the door. She ran out into the night, her breath clouding in the frigid air, her footsteps crunching through the snow. She didn't dare look back. She could feel them following, their presence a cold weight on her spine, the whispers never ceasing. She reached the village square, collapsing on the steps of the small church, pounding on the door until Father Ionuts threw it open. He pulled her inside, slamming the door shut behind her. She tried to speak, but all that came out were gasps, the cold burning her lungs. Father Ionuts knelt beside her, his face grim. "They have marked you," he said softly. "You must not return." The next morning, Christina left the village. She took the first train out, never looking back at the valley or the dark shape of the Vasile Manor looming above. But even miles away, in the safety of a bustling city, the whispers never truly left her. They were there, just at the edge of her hearing, growing louder with every passing night, calling her back to the manor, to finish what they had started. And Christina knew deep down that one day she would have to return. Because once the whispers found you, they never let you go.